The DevExpress grid control for Silverlight provides support for binding to and working with data using WCF RIA services. Next to loading and displaying data, an important feature of a grid is the ability to provide flexible and advanced editing capabilities. In this video, we'll take a look at how to bind a grid to data, enable data editing, and finally use a combo box in-place editor to update and save the data back to the database. So let's get started. I'll start with a new instance of Visual Studio. From the Start page, I click the New Project link. Here, I'll select Silverlight and click on the Silverlight application template. Next, I'm presented with the new Silverlight application window. I'll leave the first item checked so that a new website project is created to host the Silverlight application. I check the Enable WCF RIA Services box so I can use the Entities framework to bind to a SQL Server database. I click OK, and the projects are created and populated accordingly. Now, to set up the data source, I'll need to start by adding an entity's data model. So I select the ASP.NET application project and add a new item to the project. I switch to the data template category and select the ADO.NET entity data model. I specify a proper name for it and add it to the project. Next, I'm presented with the entity data model wizard. I'll specify that the model should be created from an existing database and click Next. I'll use an existing connection string for my local instance of SQL Server Express. Let's keep the connection string name as Northwind Entities. I click Next and select the products table that will be used to populate the Silverlight grid with data. Notice that I also unchecked the pluralize or singularize generated object names. This is for the sake of simplicity and the fact that we're only using a single table in our model for this demo. I click Finish and the entity data model is created and displayed inside Visual Studio. I'll rebuild the solution. This is required so that the data entities become available for use throughout the project. Now I need to add a domain service class to provide data via WCF RIA services. To do this, I'll invoke the Add New Item window for the web project and select the domain service class item. Let's give it an appropriate name and add it to the project. I'm presented with the new domain service class window where I need to specify which entities model to use for data. I'll use the only available data context and select the entities model for the products table of the Northwind sample database. I'll also check the box to enable editing. I click OK, and the product service domain service class is created and displayed in the IDE. I'll close the class file and switch to the Silverlight Designer. I rebuild the project once more. From the toolbox, I expand the DevExpress data category and drag and drop a new Silverlight grid control onto the page. I'll set it to fill the entire available area. Next, I need to create a few columns manually so that I can specify and use in-place editors. To do this, I'll select the grid control and invoke the Columns Collection Editor. I'll click to add 4 new grid columns. For the first one, I'll specify the field name and header properties accordingly. This first column also happens to be the one where I'd like to provide editing functionality. So to embed an in-place editor, I'll set the Edit Settings property to Combo Box Edit Settings. You can see that the property grid is automatically populated by properties of the in-place editor control. To configure the combo box, I'll specify its display member and value member properties accordingly. I'll continue and set up the remaining columns in the same manner. And I click OK to apply the changes. You can see in the preview that the columns have been added to the grid. I select the table view and enable the auto width property so that the columns are fit inside the grid's dimensions. I'll also go ahead and specify a name for the table view so I can reference it through code. Now let's create handlers for 2 events of the view. These events will be used to save the data. The hidden editor event is invoked every time an editor is closed. So in our case, when an item in the combo box is selected and the editor is closed, the hidden editor event will be triggered. Next, the row updated event is where we'll submit the changes back to the database. Now let's go ahead and add the necessary code for this example to work. I'll first add the following namespaces. The first two are required for WCF RIA services binding. The next one will be used for working with editors in code. I add a new instance of product context. Next, I add the following code to retrieve the data and load it into the Silverlight DX grid control. Note that as it stands right now, the combo box editor is not aware of the data source that it needs to get the data from, so I'll need to use similar code to populate the combo box. I'll move on to add the code for saving data. Since I'm only working with the product name column in this example, I'll first check to see if the hidden editor event was triggered by an editor in the product name column. If not, then no further processing is done. However, if we are in the product name column, I'll call the commit editing method of the grid's view so that the changes are posted back to the dataset. I add the code for a custom event handler that will be triggered once changes have been saved to the database. I'll use the submit changes method of the domain context to submit the updates to the database. If all goes well, then a message box is displayed informing me that the data save operation was successful. Otherwise, the error message is displayed. And I'm done. Let's go ahead and run this application to see it in action. Here it is, the grid populated with data. You'll see that I can click on any cell in the product name column and the combo box editor is displayed. Let's take the second row and change the product name to Chai. Once the editor is closed, the hidden editor event of the table view is triggered. By clicking on a different column, the row updated event is raised, saving the changes to the database. And that's when the message box pops up informing me the save was successful. Let's make sure the data was actually saved. I'll refresh the Silverlight application so the dataset is recreated and the grid repopulated. You can see that the second row now contains our newly specified value for the product name column. Thanks for watching, and of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress.